in our terrorism class. It's a bit short today because we're late getting started for various reasons, one of which is mix up on getting this live stream set up. And also I was handing out down here in Bluefield the test results for these numerous students who don't come to class. If you want your test results, you can come by my office and I'll be glad to give them to you. So, let us get back, I guess, to where I'm supposed to be. And that is the particular rise of so we finished talking about the rise of Hamas and Hezbollah. Today we want to talk about the rise of something a bit different, and that's Al-Qaeda. And ISIS. Now, as I've said before, the defining moment in the creation of what we now call ISIS occurred with the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2012 and subsequent events after that, particularly the fact that the United States government and President Bush were completely unprepared after they'd overthrown the Saddam Hussein government. They were completely unprepared for what came next, and that is, as we say, nation building. Instead, things rapidly got out of control in Iraq as people who had long been suppressed simply were now free. And the end result was that after a while, significant opposition began to take place in Iraq to the U.S. basically government. I mean, basically we had a U.S. Appointed viceroy, if you will, of the country. Attempts made it to become more to make the country democratic. The most important problem was that less than 2 weeks after the invasion, the Iraqi army was completely dissolved and disarmed, and there was no longer any form of security in the country. And so things went from bad to worse. Now, in Iraq itself, we have formed a group in opposition to the United States called Al-Qaeda in Iraq, sometimes also called Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. But Al-Qaeda in Iraq basically led by Zarqawi and was completely different than other Al-Qaeda branches. And that Zarqawi basically was against all Muslims except those that belonged to his narrow group. And thus it was that he began killing as many of the Shia and even some Sunni there in northern Iraq as he possibly could. His bombs and these fighters didn't just kill Americans, they killed civilians, Sunnis, Iraqi security forces, anyone he could. His probably greatest feat was blowing up one of the holiest shrines of Islam in all of Iraq, the so-called Golden Mosque, which he blew up for one reason, and that is so that the Sunni and Shia elements in Iraq would fight one another. In other words, this issue of Salafist Islamic purity had basically already devolved into what essentially was a gangster running terrorist operations in Iraq. His campaign and the brutality that his forces used while they were fighting the Iraqi people essentially finally turned off those who would normally and who in the past had supported him, the tribal leaders of the various Sunni tribes in Anwar province. And let me make a brief comment here. In Iraq, like much of the Middle East, governments are one thing, but the real leaders of the people are a bunch of tribal groups or tribal organizations which exist throughout the country. And they have a lot more social control over what happens on the village and local level than certainly does the government, never did. The tribal chiefs were kept down. By the way, they're called tribal chiefs. Were kept down by the Saddam Hussein regime, which basically had a secret police and army, right, which kept down any kind of sectarian violence. But the violence of Zarqawi's campaign during the 3 years from 2003 to 2006 was quite frankly just too much for the Sunni tribal leaders who, in essence, were very much anti-American because Saddam Hussein was from Sunni communities. And thus it is in 2007, the new general who takes charge of American forces in Iraq, David Petraeus, decides to launch a brand new offensive and a brand new operational modem in order to take control of the problems that were existing. The first thing he did was come up with large amounts of cash. That's right, money. Because quite bluntly, in Iraq at this time, it's American dollars that count, not Iraqi currency. This money is then funneled in to the former Sunni tribal chiefs so that they can arm their own forces and began attacking and hunting down the Zarqawi elements in the country. In addition, 30,000 American troops are now put back into Iraq for the sole purpose of putting down this insurrection that is taking place in Iraq. Now, at the time, one of the promises made was that the Sunni leaders would have full political recognition in the Iraqi government and participation in it. And with that promise made, and the money that was put into it, suddenly things turned. Okay? But on June the 7th, 2006, in a home just north of Baghdad, American trackers finally identified where Zarqawi was living, and U.S. jets fired 2 smart bombs into the house, killing Zarqawi and his family and other leaders in Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And to prove he was dead, we released a photograph of his corpse. And quite frankly, that was a mistake, because under Islamic law, that was viewed as a blasphemy, but it also meant that Zarqawi is now going to be held up as a martyr. Because normally when leaders are killed, they like to keep their death secret or hidden from the community. But in this case, he's held up as a martyr. And indeed, the very forces in Al-Qaeda that had been very hostile to Zarqawi's campaign, Zawahiri and bin Laden, give a eulogy about it. Okay, now, at this point in time, a new leader takes Zarqawi's place in the group, Abu Omar al-Baghdadi. Okay, Omar al-Baghdadi is killed in 3 years after Zarqawi's death, and quite frankly, I said Omar al-Baghdadi. You gotta get these Arabic names right. I'm speaking from 266 in your text. And now we have a new leader who takes his place, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, again, using essentially the same name. It's not his real name, but it's the same name almost. And so at this particular point in time, several things are going to happen. One, we have the Syrian civil war in full swing now. Okay. And thus it is that Baghdadi begins to rebuild the organization of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. He transforms the group into a much more less out of control organization. Okay, he wants to transform it into a Che Guevara style guerrilla army. And after about 4 years of rebuilding and putting in place trusted allies, putting in place of military units, former Iraqi generals and military commanders, and various bureaucrats who knew how to run governmental services. And thus it is that the beginning of ISIS, which is really only 8 years ago, is pretty much full in bloom in 2014. Now, what also happens, however, is that ISIS begins campaigns in 2013 in both Syria and also Iraq. And also Syria, but the forces, Baghdadi's forces, then move into the vacuum in Syria, seizing a city close to the Syrian border called Raqqa, which would become his capital of what he had already declared to be a new caliphate. Okay. Now, in 2012, a new campaign begins taking place with army units composed of former fighters from Syria, Chechnya, and of course in the Balkans. And he launches the so-called Soldiers' Harvest with these seasoned fighters, attacks Iraqi army soldiers, sets off a major concern of terrorist attacks, etc., and ends up weakening very much the Iraqi government control of its second largest city, Mosul. Now, let me also point out that at the same time, we have Iraqi units, we have the Iraqi government in 2012 making a fatal mistake, a mistake which they're still paying the price for, and that was one, the Prime Minister of Iraq insists that the U.S. remove all of its troops from the country. And even though there were some attempts to leave a significant number of U.S. forces remaining, because President Obama had campaigned in 2008 and 2012 that he would get us out of Iraq. When the time comes, instead of holding firm and leaving some forces there, all Americans in Iraq are pulled out. The Iraqi government at this point, which has fairly large army in the field, but also a very weakened army, now begins backtracking on its promises to those forces in what was called the Great Awakening, shuts out the Sunnis from government, in fact begins moving Shia settlers into Sunni areas, Sunni militias like the Al-Sadr Brigade and others start moving into Sunni areas to seize and control territory. And the Sunni tribal leaders who had banked on the U.S. and who had helped the U.S. in the surge, in the destruction of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, are not there anymore. So who is turned to protect them from a government that seems no longer to want them, even though they're 40% of the population want them in the government? They turn to this new group amassing an army in Syria called ISIS. Okay. Then comes the summer of 2014. And beginning in June of 2014, it's heavily coordinated ISIS units spread throughout Iraq and Syria, Western Syria, launch invasion into Iraq itself as forces cross the border and begin a major military conflict which ends up seizing one, without a fight, the Iraqi city of Mosul, again, the second largest city in the whole country, and then moves south, seizing most of Anwar province, and an army of ISIS fighters is soon within 70 miles of Baghdad and starting shelling of it. And that's right, the Iraqi army collapses. A bunch of cowards. In Mosul itself and outside of Mosul, they take off their uniforms so they can wear civilian clothes and won't be identified as Iraqi soldiers. They leave behind scores of tanks, artillery, all sorts of heavy weapons, which the ISIS forces know how to use. And so ISIS arrives outside of Baghdad after a 2-month campaign, almost able to take over the entire country. But two things happen. Okay? Two things happen. And that is that, again, I've already said ISIS was in Syria, had taken over again significant parts of Syria. The fall of Mosul, without really much a fight meant to the city itself, was not damaged in the battle. And thus it is that Baghdadi appears in one of the main mosques there in Mosul and announces the creation of a new caliphate with him as its ruler. Okay? And from that point on June the 29th, 2014, ISIS becomes the Islamic State, or in other words, the caliphate. At this point in time, therefore, for whatever else happens or not happens, ISIS, with all of this land now under their control, begins through its propaganda campaigns attracting thousands of Salafist jihadists from all over the world to come into their country and fight the war for them. Okay? As you can tell, as you look at the text of the various information pages, etc., it's kind of hard to say exactly everything else that could take place or didn't take place. But essentially, it is here with ISIS at the door of Baghdad that two things happen. One, the Prime Minister of Iraq finds himself suddenly having to beg for American troops to return to Iraq to save his hide. Now, actually, there were already some American advisors in the Kurdish provinces of Iraq who had been assisting with the Kurdish military units that had already been created there. So, as the ISIS army sweeps into Iraq and seizes so much of its land and property, a second event takes place, and that is that the U.S. assisted Kurdish forces, so-called Peshawar, buckle up and fight a major battle in which ISIS forces are defeated and prevented from seizing the Kurdish capital of these northern provinces. And that stops the invasion as far as the Kurdish is controlled. But it also means that American forces now sweep into Iraq. And as they move into Iraq, they basically, the Iraqi army finally gets over being such yellow-bellied cowards. I shouldn't say that, but that's in essence the way I look at it. And now, with their backs against the wall, truly become an effective fighting force. The ISIS forces are contained. They don't seize the full control of the government. They certainly were never popular in southern Iraq, since basically ISIS is a Sunni movement, and so the Shia forces come into play. It's interesting that at this time, a number of things begin to happen which are really somewhat out of context today, and that is that in Iran, they were so concerned that ISIS would take over the government of Iraq that Iranian army units began to be moved into Iraq. Also, Iranian-funded Shia militias are now let loose, and the end result is that the invasion of ISIS into Iraq is finally stopped, contained, and then we have the period that has taken place in the last 4 years of the Americans in Iraq with the Iraqi army, the Iranian-led Shia militias, and lots of Iranian arms flowing into Iraq to support the army and the militias, began a step-by-step campaign to liberate ISIS-controlled areas in Iraq. And this is a time that here in the U.S. is certainly viewed with horror, as we have ISIS propaganda videos, bragging about beheading enemy combatants, etc. American hostages being taken and then murdered in front of our faces in these ads. A very prominent propaganda figure, so-called Jihadi John, a British citizen who becomes the chief executioner at these public executions, beheading people in front of your eyes, to brag about how important ISIS had become. One of the things, your text really stops here with the ISIS invasion of Iraq, so it doesn't really cover what happened after that. But briefly speaking, what did happen is that the Iraqi forces the militias, the U.S. Army, U.S. Air Force elements began bombing campaigns that soften up the ISIS forces. And a slow but sure campaign begins to seize back major Iraqi cities under ISIS control. Probably one of the key battles is the battle for Fallujah, where so many Americans had already died once before, taking the city back from the edge of brink. This time, Marines and others go back into Fallujah, but basically based with Iraqi army forces, not American forces, because we're basically advisors. In other words, we're the ones that get the Iraqi army to buckle up and become hardened. The fall of Fallujah means now a major campaign is getting ready to be set up to seize the prized city of Mosul, which of course is close to the Syrian border. And again, as I said, the second largest city in all of Iraq. Mosul is essentially a semi-capital building, if you will, of ISIS in Iraq. And it is quite powerful, held by thousands of ISIS fighters. It takes almost a year for U.S. and Iraqi forces to gear up enough to get ready for the siege of Mosul, which takes over 4 months, almost 5 months. Mosul is seized in two parts. The eastern half of the city is seized without too much battle or fighting is the rest of the city on the other side of the Euphrates River. That's where the hard battling takes place. And the fight for Mosul becomes a house-by-house, street-by-street battle, and basically almost destroying half the city. I mean, just leveling major parts of it. The battle for Mosul is an intensely fought battle, and it's a battle fought by Iraqi army forces and the militias, but basically by the Iraqi army, which finally is able to defeat ISIS forces there in Iraq and cast them out of the country eventually, shortly thereafter. In Syria itself, the Peshwa, the Kurdish army forces, supported by the United States and armed with them, have already fought ISIS to a standstill. And then this past spring seized the ISIS capital of Raqqa, again leveling the city almost to the ground in a house-to-house battle fight. The Syrian army and the Russians, by the way, didn't really participate in that fight. So it is essentially a Syrian battle, and there are other problems that come up as a result of that. So the end result basically is, as we stand here today, most of the territorial conquests of ISIS have now been reversed. ISIS only has a small section of Syria in which they call home, under constant bombardment and threat of military invasion. It is estimated probably 40,000 ISIS soldiers died in the battles in Iraq and Syria, protecting the so-called caliphate. So what we're talking about here is a serious armed conflict. Certainly as viciously fought as anything in World War II or in Vietnam. And ISIS essentially now, territorially at least, has been defeated, although we don't know what's going to happen in the future. ISIS may very well resurrect itself again, particularly if the Iraqi government makes the same stupid mistakes it's made in the past by not being inclusive to the Sunni tribal units there in Iraq. Okay, now, with that in mind, I'm going to stop a few minutes early today. I've got a chore I'm going to take care of in a hurry before my next class. So anyway, the text stops basically on 269, 270, talking about ISIS, and I hope this brief report of events of the last 2 years in which ISIS finally is defeated can help you out on that aspect.